Sandbox campaigns can come in a lot of different varieties. While you allow your players the opportunity to drive the game where they wish, the actual setting and how your players are able to mechanically take those actions can vary widely based on your setup. Today, we're going to talk about one of the more popular sandbox styles, the hex crawl. The hex crawl is all about exploration. The rules for hex crawling support the idea that your players are embarking on this wilderness journey. Your players are heading off into the wilderness to seek lost ruins and uncover secrets and hidden treasures of the world. The reason why the hex crawl is so useful for sandbox play is because it allows you to quantify these subsections on your map. These are your individual hexes. And that provides context for what's in these sub areas of your map, and you can mechanically track your players' progress as they explore the world around them. For example, say they decide to head off in a direction for a set distance in miles. Well, you can track their progress across the map and see how many hexes they move across. And that allows you to see the different hexes that they're entering, what's located inside of those hexes, and what your players encounter as they move across the world. The hex crawl really helps provide sort of concreteness to an otherwise abstract idea, which is just go out and explore the world around you. Hi, welcome back aboard the Earthmote. I'm Randall. Today we're going to be talking about the hex crawl, the key elements of hex crawling, and how you can set up your sandbox game as one. According to Justin Alexander over at the Alexandrian, there are 4 main steps to the traditional hex crawl structure. First, you need a map. This map is constructed of these hexagons, and these are your distinct areas of exploration for your party to check out. Once you've established the map, you need a key. This key is essentially defining what's in these distinct hexagons, and you're saying, here's what's inside it. And when my players go check it out, this is what they're going to find within that region. Third, you need a set of rules to allow your players to travel across the map and what happens and what actions they can take as they're exploring the land around them. And fourthly, you need a structure for what happens when your players enter into a new hex on the map. Let's go ahead and dive into these 4 steps a little bit further. When it comes to obtaining a hex map, I think there are 3 main ways to do it. First, you can buy a published product that includes a hex crawl sandbox within it. There are a lot of great products out there that include hex maps, and the main benefit of these is not only do you get the map, but you get the key and all the details inside it to really run a great campaign with very minimal work to yourself. I'll include some links to products that I've looked at and played, along with some that are well regarded by the online communities. On the smaller side, some of my favorites are the modules by Jacob Fleming. Each of these includes a hex crawl and has a sort of mini sandbox component to them. And I also like the Dark of Hot Springs Island. Although it's on the smaller side, it's really jam-packed with information. You can see how quite thick the books are, showing off the density of that information. On the larger side, you have the Dolmenwood Sandbox campaign that's coming out. That is currently in development. If you are a backer on their Kickstarter, you have access to their PDF files, but otherwise you'll have to wait for that one. One that is currently out that's super in-depth and has ongoing products that are coming out is the Gods of the Forbidden North. The Hex Crawl and Hex Map and its key are currently out, and he is working on adding more detail to the setting and creating a mega dungeon for it. So that's super exciting, and more content is coming for that one in the future. For 5th edition GMs, I know of a lot fewer high quality sandboxes, unfortunately. Famously, Wizards of the Coast Tomb of Annihilation does include a hex crawl component to it, but it also includes more of a linear storyline that is sort of beyond the hex crawl. I don't know that I can recommend that one, but that is a hex-based adventure. I think the best 5th edition hex crawl I've seen is Neverland by Andrew Kolb. It's a fun take on Peter Pan's Neverland, and it gives you all you need to run a great game. I also mentioned earlier Jacob Fleming's module. I know the In the Shadow of Tower Silver Axe has a 5th edition version. Your second option is to use an online hex map generator tool. I'll post in the description a couple of different sites that allow you to generate these different hex maps for free, and they're pretty cool. They do a nice job. They also give you some keyed content, which dovetails nicely into step 2 of this process. So that can be a great boon for a game master running a hex crawl for the first time. I think there are 2 main restrictions on this method. First, you have limited control over what the pre-generated hex map looks like. Some are better than others, and ultimately your ability to alter and modify these hexes is going to be pretty limited. So you kind of get what you get. Additionally, as with any generated content, the keys that it includes are somewhat lacking. We'll talk more about keying in the next step. Just know that these keys are often sparse, and you probably are going to need to review them and go over them and modify them to make them a little bit more integrated and just overall better for running a good sandbox campaign. Your third option is to make your own hex map. You make a hex map like you would make any other fantasy map for running a D&D campaign. The main difference is that if you use a hex program, your regions will be distinguished by hexagonal chunks like the ones I'm showing on the screen now. The 2 main programs I know of are Worldographer and Hexkit. There is a free basic version of Worldographer, and you can upgrade to a pro version with a one-time license key purchase. Hexkit you have to pay for, although it is cheaper than the pro version of Worldographer. You could also just make a hexagonal grid overlay and lay it on top of a map you've already created, like one in Incarnate or Wonderdraft. I'm not going to go into the details on how you should go about creating a fantasy map. There are plenty of resources that go into geographical formations, and that's quite a deep topic. I could do videos on it in the future. If there's any interest, let me know in the comments below. But I will for now include a couple of blog post series that talk about how to go about making a detailed hex map. Speaking of maps, you could help me chart a good course for this video by giving it a like, and consider subscribing to the channel if you want to see more hex crawling and sandbox content in the future. Once you have your hex map created, now you need to fill out the details of what's inside each of your hexes. The biggest challenge with a Hexcrawl sandbox is the fact that a lot of your GM prep is front loaded. Your hex keys are the main content of your game, and as a result, since your players can go off in any direction that they want, you need to have a lot of that material ready for them to encounter as they start exploring at the table. You can eliminate a lot of this prep work by just using a pre-made sandbox like the ones I described earlier, but you can also cheat a little bit here if you're making your own homebrew Hexcrawl sandbox. First, I would start by keying the hexes surrounding the starting area, and that way you can get playing the sandbox straight away. But you will need to continue keying the hexes further out in the sandbox on top of any prep work that you need to handle for your upcoming session. So you're not eliminating any work here, you're just sort of delaying it and getting the game started and then continuing to do the work as the game is running. Secondly, I would get my party to commit to a plan of action at the end of each game session. That way you sort of know which direction they're planning to go off of, and you have an idea on which hexes you need to have keyed up for the upcoming game session. If you already have them finished, great. Continue to work on prepping other hexes that you haven't finished yet. And if they're going in a direction you don't have keyed up, well, now you know what you need to do for the upcoming session. So how do we key a hex? Well, you need to decide what the hex contains. This is things of points of interest, things like landmarks, dungeons, monster lairs, civilizations, castles, etc. And then you need to determine what's at those points of interest. So monsters or NPCs, treasures, traps, tricks, magic, etc. You're just sort of filling in these points of interest like you would any other location in a standard D&D campaign. I would recommend using some different tools and products to help you key your hexes. Random tables and generators can give you a lot of creative material that will really help you fill out your keys. You also need to decide how many elements and points of interest you want to include in a single hex. This varies a lot by who you are talking to, but in general, I've seen most commonly having 0 to 3 points of interest for a single hex. I'm personally not a fan of having blank hexes. It can make sense for a trackless desert or an open ocean, but playing a hex crawl is about exploration. You should have things to explore within your hexes. Most hex maps are commonly set at a 6-mile scale. The square foot area of a 6-mile hex is 31.2 square miles. That is a huge chunk of area to have nothing of interest whatsoever for your players to check out. And not everything has to be crazy in depth. A feature could be an old menhir or the remnants of an ancient statue that just provides some history or context to your players about the area around them. But it could also be a dungeon that's 4 levels deep. It's really up to you to decide what fits in each of your hexes and how deep you want to go on the different hexes. Just vary it up and add some points of interest in one and more points of interest in another, and just kind of flex it and change and see what fits your mood as you're keying your map. You'll also need to make some encounter tables for your hex crawl. Part of the risk of exploring these hexes is the chance of random encounters. To facilitate that risk, you're going to need to create a set of encounter tables to roll on once you've determined that an encounter has occurred. I've talked a bit about random encounters before in this video, so check that out if you want a little bit more context there. But what I'd recommend is making a few different encounter tables based on the terrain or regions of your hex map. That way, as your players move through the map and go through the different regions, they'll start to encounter monsters and factions that they've seen before, and they'll start to understand which of them inhabit the different areas on the map, and they'll know maybe they want to avoid or encounter different areas based on what their goals and ambitions are. They might be like, oh, we've seen the gnolls live in the hills. Maybe we want to avoid that area for the time being. To run a hex crawl, we need a set of rules that guides the players on the actions that they can take as they're exploring the different hexes. First one is all around travel. To engage with a hex, we need a set of procedural rules for traveling about the map. How long does it take the players to travel a hex? Does the travel vary by terrain type? What about if there's a road? Does that speed travel time up? And how does weather affect travel? Once you know how long it takes to travel one standard hex, that is probably a single unit of time for exploration. For every turn or established interval of turns, you need to check for encounters. Encounters are the risk aspect of the hex crawl that we just talked about. Who do they meet as they're exploring? What's the reaction of the party, and so on. These are key elements for hex crawling and sort of encountering different parties as they go through the map. Traversing the trackless wilderness has risks beyond random encounters. The players have a chance of getting lost. They can think they're heading in one direction when they've actually veered off and are heading in another. You need rules to determine the chance of your players getting lost and determining the direction that they've actually gone instead once they have become lost. You also need rules to determine how the players can prevent themselves from getting lost, and if they've gotten lost, how do they get unlost and return back on track in the direction that they were hoping to travel. You also need to think about exploration actions. While traveling is one standard unit of time, it helps to codify other actions that your players can take in the hex crawl. Can they forage for food? Can they search for keyed areas within the hex? What about resting, scouting, things like that? Can they do those actions while they're traveling through a hex, or do they have to stop and take those actions separately? These are different things you need to think about as you're creating your hex crawl rule set. If you're playing an OSR system, the odds that you'll have hex crawling rules are quite good. I run OSC, which is Basic Expert D&D, Swords and Wizardry, and Worlds Without Number, all of which have quite established procedures for hex crawling and wilderness travel. Unfortunately, hex crawling is a bit of a lost art in 5th edition. There are no good official rules for wilderness exploration or hex crawling in 5e. I'll link to the Alexandrian, which has rules for 5e hex crawling. I admittedly haven't used them, but they seem reasonable enough reading through them. I'm sure there are some other rule sets out there that you can search for if you wish to run a hex crawl in 5th edition as well. When the party enter into a new hex, you should have a procedure for sharing the information of the hex with the party. This is pretty similar to your group entering into a new dungeon room. You need to tell the features of the hex. Has the terrain shifted or stayed the same? If they've gone from a forest into a plains, that's pretty obvious and information they need to know. Is there any obvious landmark features that the players can see as they've entered into the hex? If so, relay that information to them. Is there an event or encounter or something else that triggers as the players enter into the hex? If so, share that information with them. This is pretty standard stuff. Like I said, similar to sharing the details of a room, but it's important to share this information with each hex that the players go through. So if they say they're talking in hexes and they want to say, we want to head 4 hexes to the west, well, you should narrate each of those 4 hexes individually. That way they're getting that information and maybe they can alter course as they go through the different hexes. So those are the basics for running a Hexcrawl sandbox. You need your hex map and you need your hexes keyed with interesting locales and features for your party to visit. You need your procedural rules for allowing the players to move through the hex map and taking different actions as they travel. And you need to provide them context for their next decisions as they're entering into these different hexes. Now, in past videos, I've talked a lot about the different elements that make a good sandbox. So how do we translate those into a hex map? Well, it's pretty easy, actually. Your different locations will be keyed right onto the map, and you determine which factions are operating in the different areas of your hex map. Then have them appear on your random encounter tables and have them keyed directly into the locations that they currently control or occupy. The conflicts will play out through your encounter tables and the locations that are contested between factions. Let your players see the impacts of the conflicts that are occurring between the factions and within your sandbox. As they move from hex to hex, they'll see how some areas are impacted and others are not, at least yet. Your secrets and mysteries will be learned in your different hexes. You can have these be part of locations within a hex, such as information gained inside a dungeon, or it can just be a feature directly occurring on a hex, such as a magic gateway that can be activated somehow. If you have those things down, you're well on your way to having a successful Hexcrawl sandbox. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. It does really help the channel out a lot. Thanks for watching, and I will see you aboard the Earthmote again soon.